Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Poikinen, and I am here in lockdown Boulder Creek, California. I am very pleased to introduce to you guys today a gentleman who was on the Free Assange Vigil about a week and a half ago, I think. But he is one of the few people who developed the fortitude and weighed the risk and became a whistleblower. He's an Australian citizen. He's responsible for the information that became known as the Afghan Files. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward to this very much. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, please welcome David+McBride. David, how are you, sir?
Oh, fuck.
You there?
Just my phone ran out.
All right. It's been that way like all day. I'm assuming that David's going to pop back in at some point. In the meantime, I suppose we should go ahead and put up the or go to the Afghan Files and look at those. Because these are some pretty fascinating leaks that David here was responsible for. And it's also definitely should be mentioned that the Australian police, or the Australian, it was the Australian police, they ended up raiding this this news outlet and taking their hard drives and everything else that they had as a result of them printing these leaks. So not only did David put himself in the crosshairs by doing this, the outlet that printed them did as well. I am not sure if those, okay, there we go. Let's go through this a little bit. I can't see what Josh is seeing. There we go. Let's go. The documents mini marked Osteo, Australian eyes only. That's neat. Everybody has their different acronyms. Suggested growing unease at the highest levels of defense about the culture of Australia's special forces as they prosecuted a bloody, secretive war against insurgents across a swath of southern Afghanistan. Now, David was he was part of the legal team that was attached to the Australian special. Are you here now, David? Or do we got this?
Yeah, I got this. Sorry.
Oh, right. No, it's okay. That's absolutely fine. I'm glad you could make it. David, let's introduce you to the folks here real quick and kind of give them some background on who you are and how you got to be facing 50 years in jail as a whistleblower.
Okay. Now, my title used to be Major David+McBride. And so I was a uniformed officer in the Australian Army. I was actually a lawyer. And I guess I emphasize that because it's relatively important in that I am someone very much from inside the tent. I went to law school in Sydney. I got a scholarship to Oxford University to do another law degree. I then joined the British Army when the Cold War was still on, and I wasn't a lawyer in those days because I thought it would be too boring, and I went and did a tour of Northern Ireland, and I enjoyed the Army, and eventually I left, and I was doing security type work, but I missed the Army. I came home to Australia, I got married, and I had children, and I rejoined the Army as a lawyer, but still a uniform, still having to take orders and still wearing camouflage clothes. And they send lawyers off to Afghanistan to make sure that the rules of engagement are applied. I did 2 tours. It was a job I really liked, and it was a job I was good at. On my second tour with the Special Forces, which is as same as in your military, we work hand in glove with them, but it's a very it's a prestige job. But I could see I had some telltale signs, but in 2013 I could see that something was wrong, and the way we were fighting the war on terror, as it became to be called, was becoming about face, in that it had become a self-licking ice cream where we were more interested in appearances and domestic elections, both in the US and in Australia, and we weren't interested in actually doing the right thing or winning the war. In fact, it became more and more apparent to me that we didn't give a shit about what actually went on, as long as the press in Australia was positive. And it even went to such an extent where we would kill our own people in order to get press. To bring it with an American analogy, which I'm sure you've heard in other cases, it was a bit like that movie Wag the Dog was a reality, you know.
Yeah.
And,
can I stop you real quick and just ask what a military lawyer's job is because you were attached to a couple of different divisions, ultimately the Australian Special Forces. Am I correct about that?
That's correct. Yeah, that was where I ended up. That was a job I really liked. Military law took off around the year 2000. Not so much because of 9/11, but because of the advent of drone warfare. And we were doing that in Afghanistan, and you need a lawyer there to really give the final thumbs up and thumbs down to say, we've identified that target to the legal parameters necessary to drop a bomb on that vehicle or send a hellfire into that guy's house. And the lawyer sort of protects the commander and says, yeah, we've got enough to say that you know, if our decision was ever called into question, it wouldn't seem reckless. So lawyers have a very important role, and that was a role I enjoyed. I did a lot of research on it. I think drone warfare can be you know, it can be useful as long as it's not abused. And so we do drone warfare, and also we would do it. The lawyer would every time the special forces soldiers go out, a bit like in the well-known movie Zero Dark 30, when we go and do a raid on a particular house, the lawyer will have to say, this is what you need to look for, this is who you can shoot, this is who you can't shoot. And when they come back, I look at what happened, or what they tell me what happened, and I see to make sure that we haven't broken any laws or executed anybody. So it's a pretty important job. It used to be the sort of commander's right-hand man, the lawyer. What I guess depressed me is I saw increasingly it wasn't the lawyer who was the commander's right-hand man, it was the public affairs person. And they didn't really care about the law, they just cared about the image.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see how that would be both frustrating and it would be a little bit nauseating, because public relations people have to obfuscate and spin in order to deliver the best possible message more often than not. Like the reason that you have a PR firm, at least if you're our military or most of our corporate businesses, is because you need to project an image that is vastly different than the one that you actually have. The public relations and propaganda is a pretty thin line.
That's right. And as I said, I think one of the interesting things about my whistleblowing is that I was a kind of blue chip officer. I had a good career. I had no desire to become a rebel, and public relations is part of any corporate entity. But I could see that we had crossed the line between spin, which is legal, and outright lies. It was a bit like even some, the most controversial companies like oil companies or motor vehicle companies. I mean, they can put a positive spin on what they do. But what I saw in Afghanistan was outside that paradigm, and it was more like the failed company Enron, in that we weren't doing anything real. It was really the Afghanistan war had become a Ponzi scheme, like Bernie Madoff, in that, there was no real stuff going on. We were just putting out bullshit.
Huh. That's fascinating. And you brought forth when you went to the Australian, did you go to the Australian Broadcast Company first, or how did that process go?
No, I didn't. Like most whistleblowers, again, I wanted to work within the system. And while I could see, I remember to the exact date, it was September 2013, probably, about 12 years after 9/11. And I knew something was very wrong because I'd been in the military a lot and I was well educated. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I could see that the decisions that they were making, no sane general who actually wanted to make a difference and would have made the decisions they were making. And so while I didn't see the full picture, it was a bit like an iceberg in the fog, I decided to come home and write an internal complaint. It was very politely worded, and I guess in some ways at that stage, I was still hoping they might say, yeah, we see your point. We have overstepped the mark. We have confused spin with lies. And it was the heat of battle. These things happen. Thanks for pointing it out. But I guess like most whistleblower stories, the second stage of my story was, instead of getting any kind of positive feedback from my very politely worded and considered argument internally, the organisation turned on me, and I became a pariah.
And this is for trying to work within the system, for trying to do the right thing. Was there a proverbial straw that broke the camel's back for you? Was there a moment, or was it just a gathering series of events that you were like, you know what, I have to write this memo?
There was a moment, a straw that broke the camel's back. Over there, as I said, it's hard to explain because it was quite military, in that it had to do with war crimes and it had to do with the press back in Australia. But there was a moment, and I really remember it. There was a moment when I realised that we weren't actually fighting the war to win. We weren't actually fighting the war to make a difference in Afghanistan. All we cared about was positive public press for Australia, and the reason was because there was an election coming up, and we wanted to win the election, so we were putting out bullshit stories in order to win the election. And so the cart was before the horse, in that we were just, all we cared about was making the politicians look good, and nobody cared about whether anything was true or not.
Well, and there's also a huge incentive for the manufacturers of weapons of war and of surveillance equipment to make sure that there is a constant state of conflict, not just in Australia, but internationally. It seems that every time the United States wants to go invade a country for their natural resources, there are Australians who wind up giving their own lives over to that and becoming a part of that enterprise as well.
I think that's right. And as I said, I started out an idealist.
Yeah.
I knew something was wrong then, but I didn't know quite what. And it's nice for you to point that out, because the more I looked into it, when I wrote my complaint, I started to look into the sort of secret files. I had a top secret clearance. So I started to look at other things that were wrong and to try to work out what was happening. And the more I looked into it, the more I could see that what you said was exactly right. We were more interested in being in a constant state of war to sell, because the people were the big corporates who make materials for war were giving big donations to the politicians. So the politicians were winning because they were getting donations for their campaign. But above all, the big winners, of course, were the people who were supplying the war. And it wasn't just arms. There was a company called Dynacorp, which has been in the news a bit lately, and they made a huge amount of money just out of building the bases, And you're absolutely right. It was in their interest to say the situation was really, really bad, because that allowed them to spend money or to get government money to build, or taxpayers' money to build these huge bases. And it had enormous running costs and all the food. It was trillions. I think you're right. I think people have cottoned on, and it's been around for a while, that a war is a great way to turn public money into private money, in that you get taxpayers think, oh, well, we need to fight the bad guys. They give you millions and millions and millions to build bases, to buy bombs, to build jets. But actually, there is so much kickbacks from all that spending. It goes back, and a lot of it goes back into the politicians' pockets. And so they've turned all that taxpayer money into their own money. And I think you're right. The more I looked into it, it took me about 5 years and a bit of a detective story. And it was interesting because I didn't believe that, In 2013, I didn't believe that. But in 2018, I did. I believed that it was a scam. It was being run by the big corporates. We wanted to go to a war in Iraq, and we set up the conditions to make that happen. And we wanted to go into war in Iraq because war was good in a number of different ways. It was good for elections. George Bush was returned in an increased majority. Same in Australia. No one's ever lost an election, as far as I can see, by dropping bombs.
Right.
It looks good. It also good for the funding, because the arms companies give you more money. And even the politicians get rich. The arms companies get very rich. And everybody kind of win. Of course, the people that lose are the soldiers on the ground and who die, and the Afghans. I saw a really good analogy of it, and there was increasing backlash amongst the soldiers. Like me, not everybody had the tools to become a whistleblower like I did. Like, I knew the law very well. I had top secret access, so I could see a big picture that a lot of other people couldn't see. But there was pushbacks from a lot of American soldiers, even special forces, especially special forces, because they had a plane that you would have heard of called the A-10, which was a sort of a Cold War plane. But it did the job really well over there. It was slow. It had heavy cannons on it. And if you were a special forces guy in trouble, being attacked by the masses of Taliban, that was the plane you wanted. Now, the Pentagon phased this plane out, and they brought in the sort of B-1 bombers and things that were supersonic and cost, 100 times as much. But they weren't even as good because they went so fast. They couldn't see the sort of Taliban. And while they had all this electronic kit on it, they were nowhere near as effective. And so the soldiers on the ground were like, why are you, replacing a really good piece of equipment with something which costs 10 times as much and doesn't even do the job as well? And the answer was just what you said. It was because the pressure from the sort of people that made the plane was so great that it was going to happen whether it made sense or not.
Now here in the United States, the manufacturers of that plane get to advertise on every television station. They advertise during the news. There's a news segment where they bring someone from the Pentagon on, or a retired general on, or a former NSA head on, that will sell more war. And then they'll cut to commercial, and the commercial will be from Boeing, or the commercial will be from Honeywell, or the commercial will be from General Electric. And these are all people that are profiting off of what the gentleman on the TV just told everyone. Is advertising the same way in Australia? Is it easy to spot when a narrative is being manufactured and sold now?
Yeah, we're kind of, it's the same. I think we're almost a little bit more corrupt than you, if that's possible, in the sense that they don't even bother trying to convince the public. There's a lot of backhanded deals just go on, and it happens. But I remember laughing to myself in a kind of black humour way when I came to the Canberra airport, which is the equivalent of sort of Washington, where all the government is, and there was a poster up on the wall where you picked up your bags at the baggage claim for one of these companies, McDonnell Douglas or Lockheed or one of those, and it had a photo of a jet. And I laughed and I thought, if you're a public servant who's about to buy a $1 trillion sign up to $1 trillion jet program for the country, I hope that you're not convinced by a sexy looking poster in the airport. I hope you do a little bit more research than that. I used to think, but I also thought, well, these guys are not idiots, and they obviously get some sort of return from that kind of advertising. And yeah, it made me sick. And I thought, I really hope that the decisions for buying these pieces of equipment are a little bit deeper than, I saw a poster at the airport and it looked pretty good.
Oh, yeah. No, and you know what, though? I mean, there's the poster's not there for the civil servant. The poster is there for the average person who sees it. And then when they see it on television later blowing something up, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, that's right. They'll have some familiarity with it. And if it looks like it's being manufactured at home, there's going to be a sense of nationalistic pride that is supposed to accompany that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I'm glad that you mentioned it, because I'm in the process of writing a book at the moment. And because about, my experiences, and so many things happened over a course of years that you sometimes forget about them. But I remember having that moment of clarity when I saw that. And also something else, it was during the Syrian campaign. Each year went on and I found out more and more disturbing things. It's 2018, I think it was, and we started bombing Syria in a big way with fairly unclear aims. And sometimes we were trying to destroy ISIS, but it didn't make sense that the Assad regime was also trying to destroy ISIS. And we were also bombing the Assad regime, and we were putting in these so-called, moderate Syrian rebels who weren't anything of the sort. It's the sort of stuff Julian+Assange exposed to say, it doesn't make any sense. We even had rebels sponsored by the Pentagon fighting rebels sponsored by the CIA. and it was just stupid. And I noticed, and they had another stupid name. A name it's very, very like George Orwell's 94. The name of the operation didn't even make any sense. It was something like, it wasn't Operation Resolute Freedom, but it was something like Operation Resolute Integrity or something like that.
Oh, wow.
And I noticed that they had a Twitter feed, and every day on the Twitter feed, they'd have photos of these sexy fast jets dropping bombs, and there seemed to be a lot of attention on getting a photo every day. There'd be an actual photo of the actual jets, supposedly, and sometimes dropping bombs, in order to, exactly as you said, to get across to that sort of middle of the road sort of guy who likes to see bombs going off and jets taking off, and that made him feel good about himself. And no one stopped to think, are we sure we're dropping them on the right target? And I think there was some sort of midterm election coming up or whatever, but it began to really sink in with me when I thought, we're using fast jets against ISIS, a force that didn't even have an air force, and they didn't even have any anti-aircraft guns. And so to hit the target, it's actually better to have a slow-moving aircraft like the A-10 or even like a drone, where you can actually see what you're doing quite clearly. And yet we were going for the fast jets because it looked better. We were probably missing the targets more often because they were flying at supersonic speed. That means we were probably killing a lot of civilians unnecessarily. And yet each day we'd come back with the figures and say, no civilians killed. We blew up all these, ISIS sites. And when you looked into it, it was all bullshit. We'd say, we blew up an ISIS gun emplacement, not an ISIS gun team, like not some soldiers, but an ISIS gun emplacement. And the more I drilled down to what that meant, it meant they blew up a sand dune.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and that cost, I looked up the figure, I don't remember, those bombs were like 3 million each, and they were blowing up sand dunes, they were blowing up road crossings, which they would call an ISIS, access point, but actually it was a crossroads in the desert. They'd blow that up and they'd come back and report that as a victory. And again, the taxpayers had paid for it. And not only that, is that my heart was kind of broken because I knew ISIS would come back and kill Americans on home soil. But of course, it wasn't the people from the Pentagon who were going to get killed. Or it was going to be some, nice American couple straight out of high school, just going about their day. They were going to suffer as a result. And it was the American, working class who were going to pay for, this expensive sham with their lives.
We and in multiple different ways. I mean, we did away with selective service. We did away with the draft. We have a poverty draft now, where military recruiters target low-income neighborhoods. It doesn't really matter what color you are. If you're not the right color green, then you're going to be, targeted by recruits. And at least with the U.S. military, our drones have Noam Chomsky refers to it as the global assassination program, but they miss their targets 90% of the time. But according to our military, anyone who dies in a drone strike is automatically recorded as an enemy combatant, because why else would they be dead if they weren't an enemy combatant?
Again, it's good for me to talk to you because it reminds me of that. If I'd and that's why my story dovetails in well with Noam Chomsky, because I'm an insider who saw that was actually true. Now, if you'd said that to me 5 years ago, I would have said, no, that's not what happened. But the facts of the Syrian campaign bore that out. And as a military lawyer who was my job is to know the difference between a civilian and I'd been to university on it, and I really knew that area well. Yeah, what we did is exactly what Noam says. We would just say they were ISIS, and we had some sort of incredible low strike rate of civilian deaths, which wouldn't even be possible if you were just running military maneuvers. You'd kill more than 8 civilians if you had that many planes in the air. And we were saying, 8 civilians killed and 500, ISIS. And it was clearly a lie. And again, we had crossed the line in Syria where we weren't trying to spin out the facts, and we weren't calling people who are marginally ISIS. We were just lying. And that was pretty terrible.
You in your disclosures, and at least in the article, there's a section in there about the rules of engagement.
Yeah.
And this is something that I personally found fascinating, and I'm hoping that the audience does. I'm sure the audience will as well. But if you can talk about that a little bit, we'll pull it up on the screen so they can take a look from the article as well. It's the one that I sent you that's labeled ROE. It's the article's titled "Who is the Enemy?" Word. So I mean, this was obviously a huge revelation, but can you go through why it was a huge revelation for your countrymen there in Australia?
Well, I guess the statistics show that the military in Australia is the most trusted of all the national institutions. People just assumed that everything we did was going okay, and people assumed that we would never kill civilians. And the fact of the matter is, the rules of engagement seem to have been written. They were written very badly. They were written probably to impress journalists. They were written in a very sort of high-minded way, but they weren't. There didn't seem to be any attempt to make sure the soldiers knew them or even complied with them. It was more like if anybody asked in Canberra, "Oh, what are the rules of engagement?" We'd go, "Oh, we've got lots of rules of engagement. Here's our 20-page document. Oh, look how many rules of engagement we've got." But as long as nobody found out, they didn't really care what the soldiers did. And I tried to get them to teach the rules of engagement a bit better when we had off the counter video game technology, which we could have used to explain to the soldiers, and to make sure they actually knew what they were doing. But we never even used that. In fact, when I tried to get them to consider that, they just kind of almost laughed at me and said, "Why would we want the soldiers to actually understand it?" They seemed to kind of like to have it both ways, in that they could sacrifice the soldier if he got it wrong, and and as long as nobody found out, it was fine. We had a terrible case where some soldiers were trying to get a senior Taliban person, and he wasn't home. So they should have just called the mission off and come back another day. But they decided to go to another home where they didn't have any intelligence to say that the person there that lived there was, a senior leader. They had some sort of weak intelligence, which wasn't good enough. And in Afghanistan, they had, they have these big compounds where they might have an extended family which lives in a sort of a walled area with about 50 metres squared, very thick wall. So what these Australian soldiers did was that they blew a hole in the wall, and they burst in with all their night vision gear. And someone inside the wall picked up an AK-47 and started firing at them. Now, the Australians didn't realise that by blowing open somebody's wall, they didn't know, and coming in, storming with guns, the Afghan person actually had the right to defend himself. He didn't know what was going on. And the Australians, he was hemmed in, and the right thing for them to do under rules of engagement would have been to withdraw and to think about it. He wasn't getting out. If they wanted to arrest him the next day, they could have done that. They could have waited. But they didn't do that. Their blood was up. They kept on going. There was one of him, and there was a whole squad of them. And they eventually cornered him in a room, which was clearly a bedroom. They could hear children screaming in the bedroom. They got up to it and they chucked a grenade in there. And after that silence, they could still hear more children screaming. And then they chucked another grenade in. And they killed, eventually, there were 5 children in there. They're all dead. The mum had lied on top of them to save their lives. She survived, but I can't imagine too much quality of life. And there were 2 others, adult females, who survived. But it was pretty terrible. And those soldiers had no idea of the rules of it. They had no right to do that. They weren't acting in self-defence in that they'd burst into this person's house, and you can't have self-defence on self-defence. They didn't know he was Taliban. And they had a lot of options to just withdraw and think about what they were going to do rather than just charge in. And they did hear the screaming of children, and they went out anyway. So the rules of engagement were not understood. And the military, what scared the leadership about that case was that they knew that in any honest judgment on that case, the leadership would also be in the frame, in that they hadn't trained the soldiers well enough. These people were kind of the equivalent of your part-time soldiers, like the Coast Guard, okay. And so they didn't they should never have been there. They didn't understand who the enemy was. And that sort of thing sent our cause so far backwards because the Afghans just thought these guys are just here to kill us. That you only have to do that once and you lose all the support for a very long time.
And there's a very vaguely worded phrase in the rules of engagement called DPIH, which means you can shoot unarmed civilians if they are DPIH, which means directly participating in hostilities. Now, in the U.S., anywhere the U.S. military goes outside of the green zone, the people can be considered to be directly participating in hostilities, which, is part of the reason why you never see civilians on the body count when they're reported here. Is it similar, or like is it one of those things where it's just it's written so vague that it's up to the individual CO to interpret it?
No, in Australia, that term is actually broken down. As I said, it's explained very badly, and we've got these kind of lawyers who think that they're smart, but they're actually not that smart. And what they did was that they took that phrase out of the international law instruments. But of course, that means nothing to a soldier on the ground. And I tried to get them to change it and to say, you need to say something like, for a soldier to shoot someone, there should be 3 pieces of evidence. For example, the guy's holding an AK-47, that's 1. He's pointing at me, that's 2. And I believed he was going to fire it, that's 3. But you need to have it in terms that soldiers can, explain, because we tried to put people on trial for not interpreting DPIH properly. But of course, how are you going to explain that in a trial when when we used phrases like reasonable and necessary, and it just didn't make any sense. The soldiers didn't have any clear guidance about when they could open fire. And they could go on trial even if they'd done everything right, because the prosecutor could say, well, that wasn't reasonable. And the soldier would be like, well, what does that mean? You know, the guy looked like Taliban, had a gun. What does reasonable mean? Or that wasn't necessary. And we didn't teach people properly. I don't think our guys opened fire as much as your people did. And I know your people did, in that you saw somebody and you just fired. But we were just as bad in that we didn't really know what we were. A lot of the time they did know what they were doing, but they were always open to prosecution because it wasn't clear what the rules of engagement actually were in real terms, and we didn't make any effort to make that clear. And that caused a sort of frustration in the troops. We've recently heard that some troops just executed people that they'd captured. And there was a video, I think we discussed it last time, where it was quite clear that someone, a special forces soldier, just shot a guy in the field, not for any particular reason, but just... And a lot of that was probably from the frustration of the fact that they knew they were fighting a bullshit war with bullshit rules of engagement. There was no point capturing people; they'd be released. And that, as I said, a lot of that was to do with the leadership. The leadership did not try to help them and say, you know, you can do it in this regard, you can't do it in this regard, and we'll keep these people in prison if they really are Taliban. You know, we didn't help our soldiers, and they got frustrated, and I think they did. Well, some of them did actually just execute people.
Yeah, it's. I know a lot of people in the military. I've volunteered and written grants for a couple of veterans nonprofits organizations over the years. So I understand exactly, you know, where you're coming from, what you're talking about. I want to shift gears a little bit to kind of talk about where you're at in the legal system. You are facing up to 50 years, which is a ridiculously punitive punishment. And when you were on the vigil, I had asked you what the court process looked like, because ours, of course, is completely closed due to national security, and there's no media presence there. The legal team can't disclose can't disclose hardly anything. So if you could kind of walk through that with us and let us know where you're at, court-wise, and what that may look like for you.
I'm going to trial in September, so about 6 months away. I'm facing a long time in prison. I'm not that... I'm concerned about it. I mean, as I explained to you last time, it was a sort of a plan B for me. I tried to get the press interested. I was hoping this was going to be an Australian Watergate, in the sense that I hoped the press were going to say, hang on, the government is lying to the people, a bit like what came out in the both in the Pentagon papers back in the Vietnam days, but also in the recently, I think they called it the Afghanistan papers that were in the New York Times, where the government were lying to the people. And I think that's serious, and I was hoping that would be exposed. That didn't happen, a bit like Julian+Assange's case. The corporate media are not that interested in shining a light on, bad things in very high places. It's too hard. It involves their corporate sponsors, etc. And they were. I was surprised, but no one was that interested. So in that story. But so my plan B was that to get arrested, because I thought the only way to get these issues looked at would be in front of the mind of a judge, a decent judge, who could say, and my defence would be, I gave the documents to the press because I was justified because there was so much corruption in our government, and the war was a scam. And a judge would see that, but outside of the court, the Defence Department had just huge pockets for public affairs, and they could just steamroll you. So I thought the court was kind of my safe place. I know it's not in America, and I'm quite shocked by your intelligence courts. We are copying you a little bit in that the government have tried to close the court, and so no one can actually see what goes on. And they're probably hedging their bets that if I don't get convicted, or even if I do, they don't want people finding out about it. And especially they know they're quite vulnerable, because my defence is, if you'd seen what I'd seen in the government, you'd be a whistleblower too. And they don't want anyone to have to see. And they certainly don't want a judge to publicly agree with me. So they can't, it's not as draconian as the States, but they can close the court. There's another whistleblower called Bernard Collaery who exposed the fact that the Australian CIA equivalent bugged the officers of the East Timorese government in order to for an Australian oil company to get a better deal in a big negotiation. And that was obviously, it was good for me, because that's similar to show that the government are not following the law. The government are following whatever their corporate backers want them to do. Now, he's going to trial at about a similar time frame. He is fighting he's on a secret court as well, and he's fighting that to the death. His tactics are, I'm going to fight the constitutionality of a secret court, and I guess he's hoping that he'll win on that, and then the government won't want their dirty laundry exposed, and so they won't put him on trial. My tactic is slightly different, and I'm saying, to the government, bring it on. I don't really want a secret court, but if we have a secret court, hopefully the issues will still be looked at by a judge. And so I'm saying I'd rather have a secret trial, as long as I get a fair trial, that will be okay. At the moment, we've got a bit of a hybrid where my case will be closed if anything secret is being discussed. The problem is, of course, the government are saying their definition of what's national security is so goddamn wide. It's even, where the toilets are on a base. And so I think that they're trying to play smart, and they're saying, oh, well, the court is not going to be completely closed, only when national security information is discussed, but everything that turns up will probably be national security information according to them, and we might end up arguing about that. As I said, I don't want to fight that to the death. As long as we look at the real issues, I'll be happy. There's meant to be a jury trial in my case, which is quite different to America. And so I don't know how they're going to do that. If you've got 12 mums and dads from around Australia sitting in trial, I don't know how they're going to be able to hear the so-called national security information. I'm glad there's a jury trial. Again, I'm convinced that no normal people will convict me, or not all 12 anyway. But I guess we'll see what happens. My plan C, I guess, is to go to jail, because I think that the more publicity you get from the trial, that can sometimes help the cause, because at the end of the day, I'm not so much interested in my own security. I'm interested in making a difference with the sickness of the corporate wars that are going on, just like you discussed. I mean, that Noam Chomsky nightmare is a reality. We are in a state of endless war because it is good for business and it is good for politicians. And I want to try to make a dent in that. You know, that's my aim, whether I go to jail or not. I really want more of everyday people to know what you and I know.
That's remarkably brave and incredibly commendable. And I think that this is a fantastic place to wrap up the conversation. We've got your GoFundMe up on the screen right now for the audience, and the link to that is going into the live chat right now. And I'll make sure that that gets put in the show notes after the fact. I want to thank you very much, David. This has been fascinating, and I could probably go on for like another 3 hours, but my kids are starting to lose it. So I'm going to go ahead and wind down. But please tell the people who are watching where they can find you and how to stay up on your case and your book.
Yeah, thanks so much. My book's called The Nature of Honour. It's going to be published in Penguin later this year. I'm on Twitter, David+McBride. I call myself Murdoch Cadell, but David+McBride, if you search that. I've got a YouTube channel, David+McBride Trial, where I sometimes post little stories about the trial. As we get closer to the trial, I'll post more on there because it's the story of the trial is interesting in itself. But yeah, the greatest thing for people to do is just spread the word. If you can say to one of your friends, maybe have a look at this, because obviously the big daddy of my argument is the States. And that's why you guys really make me feel good, because obviously that's where I need to go. Australia is just really, we just follow the States. And it's your activists in the States who are really, you're the ones that can make a difference. And I really applaud you. You do have power. You stopped the Vietnam War, and I think you've got the power to really make a difference in this. No one else can do it but you guys. So if you pass it around, it'd be it would help me, and then I might be able to help you.
Well, we will certainly keep talking about it, and we'll have you back both on the Free Assange Vigil and back here if you'd like. I really enjoyed this conversation. That is going to do it for today. I will be back tomorrow at some point. But this has been Slow News Day. I'm Steve Poikinen, and good luck to us all.